The Global Perspectives Experience 2020.
Welcome everyone, welcome back. I'm delighted to be here to launch the second edition of the International Civil Society Centre's Civil Society Innovation Report series. Every year, we focus on a particularly challenging or complex contemporary context in which all civil society organisations are working, but one that is really underexplored in terms of sharing experiences and learnings. Last year, we looked at populism. This year, we're looking at urban inclusion. So we have just launched a website today. You can explore it later in your own time at icscentre.org/innovation report/2020. And what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes is really give you a bit of a guided tour into what you can find on the website, and then focus down on the recommendations, which were really bottom-up recommendations, which came from across the 14 case studies which we're looking at. And then we'll move into a panel discussion, which will focus on those recommendations. So if you go to the website, you will be met with a homepage that looks like this. And there are three main sections. So the core of the report are a definition section, which looks at the inclusion and innovation dimensions that we looked at. So 4 inclusion dimensions and 2 innovation. The real meat of the report, which are the 14 case studies, which are truly global in scale from a range of different urban contexts, and the 6 recommendations, which we'll explore together shortly. So firstly, the definitions that we used, we looked at 4 aspects of inclusion. So these were system integration, so really looking at approaches which targeted multiple levels of the urban system. So either vertical integration, so different levels of the city system from the neighbourhood up, or horizontal integration in terms of multi-sectors and looking across lots of different sectors. The second aspect was multi-stakeholder engagement and delivery, and we've identified up to 15 different stakeholder groups that the organisations were working with collectively. And we also looked at inclusion in terms of both process and outcomes. So this was, in terms of process, it was making sure that there was really active community engagement. And in terms of outcomes, it was delivering results that either increase social cohesion, reduce barriers or marginalisation for particular key stakeholder populations, or look at inclusive opportunities for these key populations or whole communities in citywide processes. In terms of the 2 innovation dimensions that we looked at the level of disruption. So this is the level of transformative change which the approach has brought either into the sector or to the city or both. And it's really about that transformation being sustainable, so that the old previous status quo of ways of working or policies or decision making are unlikely to revert or want to revert back to the previous status quo. And then we also looked at scalability. So does this approach look at multiple neighbourhoods or areas within a city? So are they citywide? Is it multiple cities within a country, so it's national? Or is it multiple cities in multiple countries? Which is international scalability. So the next area and the real heart of the report, the 14 case studies. And these are really from a broad range of organisations in lots of different urban areas in the world. I'll talk you quickly through what they are and what you'll find. So the first 3, I think, are really interesting to take together. These are all organisations that are looking at data for decision making in a way that really builds a new shared system-wide framework for collective responsibility conversations between otherwise disconnected city and community actors. So there's Amend, which looks at safer journeys for school children in sub-Saharan Africa. There's the Asia Foundation Women for the World and VB, which are looking at other aspects of urban safety in Myanmar. And then there's Community Solutions in the USA, who are a network of cities that are really finding solutions to reduce homelessness. So very, very different contexts, but taken together, very interesting contrasts. Then we have Help Aid International's work, which is global advocacy and community level research and activism in India and Kenya. We have World Vision's global Cities for Children framework, but contextualized to a very dynamic context within Honduras. We have the South African Urban Food and Farming Trust looking at urban social farming in Cape Town and South Africa, and you'll get a chance to hear from them in one of the workshops after. We have Urban Refugees. Again, you'll get a chance to hear from them, empowering refugee-led organisations for humanitarian response in Uganda. Then we have Mosaico, Action for Refugees, which is a refugee-led organisation, but European-wide network builder par excellence in Italy. We have Welcoming Australia, which is working with 50 local councils and communities across Australia to ensure that the benefits of cultural diversity, migration, and social inclusion are enjoyed by everyone. We have Plan International's Safer Cities for Girls, which you'll also get a chance to hear about later. ActionAid Association India's work on collectivization, research, and both urban narrative and policy change. And I'm sure Sandeep will be able to talk a bit about that. We have Habitat for Humanity and Slum Dwellers International and their innovative work on housing solutions globally. And finally, we have Site Savers India. And we will be adding content for these last 4 case studies and a PDF version of the report by the end of the month. But please do go and explore. I think it's really important to notice that it's a real co-creation process with all of these organisations. What you will find when you delve into a case study is some of the key information represented, the stakeholders that they're working with, the innovation criteria, context for the city, the outcomes. And we have also introduced a new self-disruption in the way we've done this report this year. We can't really talk to the other organisations about this self-disruption and not look at our own ways of innovating. And this is really to be more inclusive. So rather than writing down the stories that people are telling us about what they're doing, why not hear from them themselves? They're much more interesting, nuanced, and you learn a lot more. So the website has a very short snippet which explains the big idea behind the approach, but then you have the chance to go through and listen to a longer podcast, on average about an hour, where we really delve into all these aspects of inclusion and innovation with everyone. So the recommendations are very bottom up. And if there's one thing that you do look at, please do look at these recommendations. So the first is really to give urban the respect it deserves. If we do a quick thought experiment and you ask either yourself or your colleagues to think through the five of the defining megatrends affecting our work globally, both in terms of their own prominence and how influential they are on other trends, you're likely to think up urbanization amongst other things such as climate change and digitalization. But then if you ask yourself how it's influencing your work or how you're responding as an organization, I think in many cases you would find it hard to have that narrative or that story in the way that we do have on some of these other trends. What we're seeing with many organizations is that actually urban working is incidental rather than fundamental to their work. But we have some organizations that already have about 20 to 50% of their global programming portfolio in urban contexts. But whatever it is now, whether you know that, it is definitely going to increase. So we really need to focus priority, strategy, and resourcing on this area. It's also been a very interesting journey. I think this is our sector's best kept secret, just exploring and identifying some of these case studies has been like navigating a secret world. I've had to go to specialist conventions or, be directed to innovative examples through trusted networks or read a blog. It's not really anything that we're talking about, but it's really something that we should be talking about. So the second is elevating compound and community protagonists. This compound protagonism is something that I've stolen from one of the case study contributors, Community Solutions. Success in cities is about many stakeholders working together as one system. And our role of CSOs within that, and especially ensuring that community protagonists are at the heart of these compound narratives of us working together. What we find is that time and time again is that those key stakeholder populations that are excluded are natural imagineers of a much more inclusive city. You'll see that with the refugee-led organisations and the young people from the sessions later. We need new skills, relationships, and abilities to navigate all of these power dynamics in cities. We need to get better at telling these stories of collective responsibility and success. And we need to get better at telling these stories to each other in terms of helping us learn and navigate this journey together. We need to really get to grips with systems thinking, understanding what our roles and levers as CSOs are within these whole systems to make those more coordinated, or intentionally introduce disruptions where necessary to make them more inclusive. We also need to get better at working in areas that are not operationally stable and in these complex environments. Cities are porous, precarious, they're transient, and there are multiple intersecting identities of community that are not physically delineated. We also need to move very much from outputs to outcome thinking. And what we see with a number of these case studies is that when they've abandoned some already very successful approaches, which were delivering very successful outputs, but not actually moving the dial on the challenge that they were addressing, they have really been able to unlock transformative change in the urban ecosystem when they refocused on outcomes. And what we also find with organisations that have entry points for specific key populations, they are also delivering universal outcomes and benefits for other people living in those cities. So I think this shows how we can think bigger in terms of universal design and thinking in areas such as like smart cities with some of the work, I'm going to name check World Blind Union here, but some of the work that they're doing, which really looks at these kind of universal areas. The fourth area, we need to seed good and continuous self-disruption. So we should stop hoping for or holding out for durable solutions or best practice in cities. Instead, what there are sets of promising approaches and tools which we can bring together in shifting context-specific combinations, which have to be accountable to and inclusive of community data and insights. We need to be able to refine and abandon what we're doing and embrace short cycles of continuous self-disruption. But even this hyper-flexibility is not enough. It's not sufficient just to respond and adapt to the change in the external context. We need a strong futures focus and work with different scenarios to inspire and disrupt change to the system. Fifth, we really need to invest in horizontal learning and knowledge management structures. This is a common theme of success and sustainability across all the organisations. There's four main opportunities. So there's one within CSOs, between CSOs, there's not really this kind of sector level coordination and learning, but what you see in this report is that you can learn, there is a lot to learn across very different contexts. There's huge opportunities and successes learning between CSOs and cities and urban practitioners in terms of really understanding that system and then finding the niche within that and building these kind of horizontal collaborations and learning units between parts of a city or between cities, both to enable virtuous competition. But what we've really seen is that these networks have really been repurposed to really huge benefit during COVID-19 response. Finally, the report identifies 3 different routes to scale, which will be nicely illustrated by the 3 case study organisations that we have after. What we see is many small organisations thinking big, many big organisations thinking small. But the really empowering insight from this report is that we can all do and we can all think big. So there are 3 different routes to scale. So there's one where organisations have been using and nurturing advocacy and academic networks to really amplify their local level experiences. So the South African Urban Food and Farming Trust is a good example of that. We have organisations that have developed methodologies and approaches and applied them themselves and are increasingly looking to support others to scale those internationally. Urban Refugees is a good example of that. And then we look at organisations like Plan and their Safe Cities programme, organisations with global reach, which have developed and tested these flexible frameworks or approaches, which are a global toolkit, but then been able to contextualise them locally. But what we really need to do is think through how we can ride these different routes to scale, regardless of our size, but especially help to scale the work of the others. So my final thoughts. Our future is an urban one. It is inevitable. For the people that we need to work with, it is inevitable. We can be dragged into this urban future individually and unprepared, or we can step into it collectively and competent. The opportunities in cities are huge if we can make these 6 shifts. And my main message from this report, and a very empowering one, is that this can stop being our sector's best kept secret and become our sector's best success story. So I'd like to explore these ideas with the panel. I just want to say some quick thank yous. This was really a massive co-creation exercise with our 14 case study organisations. Each one of them has put as much, if not more, effort into this as we have. So a huge thanks to each of them. I'd also like to special thanks to 4 in particular: Habitat for Humanity, Plan International, ActionAid India, and World Vision. And I'd like to extend my thanks to Andrew and Sandeep. These organisations have really helped be friends, guides on this journey, steer us, help organise workshops, commenting on multiple drafts. We really couldn't have done it without you over the past year. And finally, to our donor, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Strong Cities 2030 programme, which we couldn't have done this without as well. So I'd like now to invite Anna and Sandeep and Andrew to join me, please, as we discuss some of what I've just talked about. Hi, so I'm really pleased to be joined by Anna from Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. So as I mentioned before, they've been supporting this report, and Andrew and Sandeep, who are representing 2 of the case study organisations, but also organisations that have really invested heavily in understanding the impact of their organisations in urban areas over the past few years. So my first question to each of you, Anna first, in the context of your work with Strong Cities 2030 in particular, you have a peer-to-peer network of young politicians in cities around the world. From the kind of recommendations, what really struck you? What did you find surprising? What did you agree with? You could disagree with something, I don't mind. But yeah, please share your thoughts on what we just said.
Well, thank you, first of all, Vicky. To be honest, at first, I have to admit that it was kind of a tough decision to actually choose only one. So, but I finally made a decision, and I've chosen a particular aspect of recommendation 4, actually, that truly touched me and struck me, as you put it. And I would indeed like to relate that one to my professional life, but I will still try to keep myself short. So as part of my job, as you mentioned, at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I coordinate a global network of young local politicians and urban planning experts called Strong Cities 2030. And we basically aim to build a network on a very individual level that on the one hand, for sure promotes the importance of cities, and on the other hand, enables the sharing of knowledge across nations, in particular with regard to sustainable urban development. So we've got an upcoming conference next week on building a new urban resilience in post-COVID times. And when I was recruiting case studies for the conference, I asked our network to present their ways of dealing with the pandemic in their home cities worldwide as actual case studies. So doing that, members told me that they were not ready to make a case yet, and that this is still too early to present durable and long-term solutions. So what I experienced is that they obviously expected me to ask them for best practices, even though I was only asking for first approaches. And also talking to them through all those Zoom calls during the last month, I was clearly seeing what they have already achieved, but they weren't. So going through the summary of the recommendations lately, you wrote that the case studies together indicate that there can be no fixed receipts for success, durable solutions, and even best practices. Instead, what exists and emerges are sets of promising approaches, tools, and practices. And that's the point that I would like to stress, and that really struck me, to be honest. until last week, I thought that the misunderstanding between me and the network, the Strong Cities network, might have been a matter of communication on my side, actually. To be honest, but reflecting on the recommendations, I now feel that it might be a much more fundamental matter of communication that applies to at least many of us. So I think the message that we should get through as organizations is that anything counts, basically, and as long as anything counts, as long as cities and communities keep moving.
Great, thanks, Anna. So Andrew, on a slightly different scale, you're 250 plus cities worldwide. What, with World Vision, what really struck you or did you find surprising?
Yeah, thank you. I was encouraged by the recommendations that the report put forward, and it's, as you said, you know, we're in hundreds of cities across the world in every continent, and it's reassuring to know that the learning is emerging from other CSOs, and it's similar to what we've been hearing and seeing too. At World Vision, we've had urban programming really from the beginning when we were formed 70 years ago, but we were very intentional in starting investment and research in this in the early 2000s, and most of the recommendations in the report are similar to lessons that we've learned, but it's great to see them all in one place. The thing that really struck me and the thing that really stood out for me, and it's something that we're learning across the organization in many contexts, is the importance of partnering, that we can't do this alone. And the history where any agency or any CSO really felt that they could achieve what they need to achieve alone has been proven really false by this report, but also what we've learned this year with COVID. And I know you mentioned it in your second recommendation that in our urban work, partnering isn't optional. It's how we get to scale. It's an essential enabler of change. And in many of the cities where we work, we've assumed the role really of a convener, of a facilitator, bringing together a number of different actors, including faith leaders and including faith leaders from Christian organizations, but also from cross faith, to really develop a vision that we all buy into and then all make a difference to. So this idea of partnering, and that particularly partnering with faith leaders for us, which you call out the importance of partnering in your report, that's been one of our key learnings.
Thanks, Andrew. And Sandeep, I mean, you've been working across 32 cities in India, all sizes, although no city is small in India. This is the thing, the sheer scale at which even a small city is like 2 million people. But also you co-chair the World Urban Campaign. So you breathe this stuff. What are your reflections on the recommendations that we found in the report?
No, I want to begin, and thank you for this. And I want to begin by congratulating you, Vicky, for this leadership, and to the International Civil Society Center for bringing out this report and focusing on the question of urban inclusion. So really, warm congratulations. We are a case study that's incidental, but the issue is important. And you know, you mentioned about the World Urban Campaign, and the World Urban Campaign's assembly is just ongoing. I just left it to come here. And in that space, what strikes me every time, and I think you capture it here, is the fact that there is civil society, the professionals groups, the builders group, the construction groups, the business groups, the industry groups, which are all very well ensconced in defining what urbanization and what cities would look like. You know what's missing, and you are talking about secrets that civil society seem to have kept. But what's really missing is the agency of city makers, the majorities of the ones who make the city, the majorities of the city, the workers of the city, the domestic workers, the construction workers, the sanitation workers, the ones who are responsible for running the city and making the city, on whose labor the city is built. And this crisis The COVID crisis exposed how the city can come to a grinding halt overnight. Were these workers to move away from the city? It happened across the global south and in parts of the north as well. And on whose shoulder the city runs. So in some ways, that agency is missing. And that is precisely what, building on what in India you mentioned about the 32 cities, and you mentioned about ActionAid Association India's work, and that is precisely where we are, trying to work to encourage and promote those leaderships and spaces of city makers themselves, quote unquote. The domestic workers, the sanitation workers, the construction workers, the ones who run markets, the countless informal workers in the cities. And I think that's really missing. And I think that's an historic opportunity that we all have, and a responsibility that we all have. Very wonderful to hear Andrew when he talked of partnerships. So yes, absolutely. And that's the kind of partnerships we need to promote those leaderships, that agency, those spaces who will define the cities and the future of cities. That's the contestation to my mind on the question of city, on the question of urbanization, Vicky.
Thanks, Sandeep. I think I'd like to pick up on that question of resources and opportunities. In this kind of shift that we outline about secret to success story, what are the main opportunities that we can draw on? What are some of the big barriers that we need to overcome? And how will this challenge us in new ways to work, both as individual organisations and collectively? Starting with you, please, Anna.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess that connects to what I said previously already. As an individual organization, we as KAS should continue giving people a voice to speak up for their communities and projects, but at the same time, I feel that it's about increasing our ambitions to put those people on spotlight who may not usually or who may not always be on spotlight. So it's also about encouraging people, as I said earlier, I think it's about also encouraging people to be more courageous, I guess. But on a like taking a broader stance, I still often experience that cities and urban areas are actually perceived as large problems to sustainable development. And reflecting on climate change, economic success, or basically any social matter as well, if we successfully take sustainable pathways in urban areas, we have covered a majority of issues already. So cities are actually a key to sustainable development and not the actual problems. So for us as a collective, I think it's, I believe that it's, that we carry a responsibility for changing the narrative about urban areas and cities, first of all, and that's thereby, and I will take up upon the first recommendation of the report again, that's basically giving urban the respect it deserves.
And I think it's as much about thinking of the opportunities and the resources that are in cities. And I think, you know, the World Vision Honduras case study makes this very, very well. There's city level resources in a productive area of the country that you can mobilize, as well as all the ideas and the creative capital that come from the communities themselves. Andrew, same question to you, please. Barriers, opportunities, challenges. What do we need to do differently?
Thank you. Thanks, Vicky. And I was thinking, as you're speaking, it's interesting that that sometimes the barriers can be an opportunity. And I was reflecting last year. I was in Honduras, which is where our case study came from, in San Pedro Sula, or San Pedro Sula, as they pronounce. And it's a really rough place. There's instability, there is amazing violence in a large city there. But one of the things that our work can do there is not only bring short-term relief, but also be a road to peace. So working in urban contexts and in fragile urban context can actually give us an opportunity to sow some seeds of peace that can make a difference not only in those communities, but then that those seeds can grow and fertilize and spread across the country. And we know that urban conflict and fragility is increasing. We know that urbanization is increasing. So having peace and bringing stability in those areas is more important than ever. So I would say that the challenge is the fragility, but the opportunity is being able to bring peace and for that peace to then spread across countries, but from the urban centres.
Thanks, Andrew. And Sandeep?
Yeah, you see, I would first go on the opportunities quickly. I think urbanization is being content defined for a large part of Asia and in Africa. Latin America, one can say, is relatively much more urbanized. History tells us this. So I think that there is a possibility of defining what in line with what Anna was mentioning, in what sustainable urbanization can hold both in content and direction for endless number of cities in Asia and Africa. So I think there's a huge opportunity for, let me call it intervention there, quote unquote, or agency there to change the discourse of going ahead. You know, the other fact remains, Vicky, that politics is becoming more and more urban. We saw this in Thailand. Yeah, more and more cities are now shaping what governance would be, what parties in power would be. So I think popular politics in future is more and more becoming urban made. For good or for bad, I'm not making a value statement, but that's what's happening. So I think in the shape of national governance, urban politics plays a huge role, and that's a huge opportunity in determining the direction once again. You know, the other opportunity is this COVID crisis. So it has opened up, this sort of rupture has opened up the possibilities of what sustainable urbanization could look like. And it has made urban governance very open at this moment. We're working with city governance across of ideas, of innovations, of the futures forward. So I think there's huge opportunity. We sit on a cusp of an opportunity. And needless to say, there are challenges. The bigger challenge is, which is this agency, which is the instrument which is there to make that happen. And I spoke to it earlier. One would tend to think it is the large majorities who need to decide, decide what the right to the city is. Whose right to the city are we talking about? The second challenge that I see, and builds on once again what Anna says. You see that there is the thinking, the narrative of urban as being a parasite on the rural. To an extent, it's historically true. And I think that's the narrative one needs to change. And that needs to change on a substantive basis of what is sustainable urbanization. And I think that's an opportunity for all of us that we need to make. It's a big challenge to overcome. You know, for in some instances, yes, urbanization is at the cost of rural distress. And that needs to be rebalanced in the future going forward in the pathway of sustainable urbanization. So that's what I would like to highlight, Vicky, for the moment.
Thanks. I think that just reflects on what you said about the urban politics, that one of the case study contributors said, if we don't get change at the national level, but we get enough of the big cities, that can force change at the national level. So, I quite like this idea of opportunities with cities as a kind of more bottom up way, especially if some of the urban politics that we're seeing. So I do want to have some time for Q&A. So I think we will stop there, and I will just see what kind of questions we're getting from the audience. Okay, we didn't have any questions actually, so I'm going to ask you instead for final thoughts and reflections before we hear about the 3 workshop opportunities for participants to join. So Anna, final thoughts or parting shots for people to take away, please.
Well, I think my final thought is simply saying thank you to you, Vicky, as the leader of the innovation report, but also to all 14 CSOs as well. A big thank you for your work.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And thank you for supporting this. It wouldn't have happened without you. Andrew?
Yeah, I would also share my thanks. It's important work. It's becoming more important as the move to urbanisation increases in speed as a result of COVID. That's often where the health infrastructure is, and people are migrating to where health infrastructure is. So this becomes a more important issue. And I said it as my first point, but I'd encourage us all, as we work in this area, to continue to work together, because there isn't one sector in urban situations. It's all multi-sectoral. You can't do wash work without health, without education. They're all so tightly linked that only by working together can we really make the difference that we really want to see.
Thank you, Andrew. And Sandeep? You're on mute.
Yeah, agreeing with all Andrew said and Anna said before me, I thank you for this leadership, and to the International Civil Society Center. I think it's a very timely piece of work, bottom up and collective. So congratulations. I want to say that the question of who does the city belong to is the most important one that I think at this moment isn't populated. We have a notion of something called the right to the city, a momentum which is gained in certain cities in Latin America because of the very higher levels of urbanization there, up 90% up in many countries. So in some ways, the idea of whose right it is, whose right it is, what is the right to the city, is an important one. It isn't quite defined as yet. So I think that's where a lot more attention need to be. A lot historical work went into land rights in the rural context. So what really unfolds in the urban contexts, I think is an area of an opportunity. I mean, is a future we need to define and populate. And I think that would be my final invitation and thought for agencies to lead it, to think it through in the interests of equity and justice within the idea of urbanization itself. So thank you, Vicky, for this opportunity.
Thanks, Sandeep. That's really important. And we want this just to be a conversation starter. I think we want people to keep coming back to the report and delving in, listening to the content. Do come back. We will be adding more content, and get in touch if you want to get in touch, if you want to find out more or connect to any of the organizations involved, or if you have something to share, case study that we missed out on, get in touch. We want to be able to continue these conversations.